The Holy Grail never existed, at least not as the golden chalice you've been led to believe. In a dimly lit monastery chamber, a medieval monk labors by candlelight, quill scratching parchment. He pauses, contemplating the fantastic tale he's concocting. A sacred vessel from Christ's Last Supper, infused with divine power. His superior watches approvingly from the shadows. This fabrication isn't innocent storytelling, it's calculated political theater. The monk isn't preserving history, he's inventing it. Blood has been spilled for this fiction. Kingdoms have fallen chasing its ghost. The Church has built an empire on its mystique. What you think you know about the Holy Grail is perhaps the most successful marketing campaign in human history, a pagan ritual object transformed into Christian propaganda that continues to deceive us 1,000 years later. The candlelit image is shocking, and it rattles the comfortable classroom version of the past you probably learned in school. That neat, satisfying tale, Christ's cup, Joseph of Arimathea, knights questing for salvation, is the story most people carry in their heads. Now, before we start pulling that story apart, let's say it plainly. This is the official version everybody recognizes. We'll retell it exactly as it has been taught, staged, and sold for centuries. The story begins with a simple scene everyone knows. At the Last Supper, Jesus takes a cup, blesses it, and passes it to his disciples. In the tidy narrative, that same vessel survives crucifixion, becomes a relic of Christ's blood, and acquires miraculous properties. Healing, abundance, the promise of life renewed. Joseph of Arimathea, a pious figure in the gospel accounts, becomes the vessel's carrier. In popular legend, he crosses the sea and brings the chalice to Britain, where it vanishes from the historical record and reappears in myth as a sacred object waiting to be found. This version is cinematic. It supplies a beginning, a loss, a quest, and a moral. Only the pure of heart may reclaim divine favor. Medieval romances embraced it and polished its edges. Chrétien de Troyes, Wolfram von Eschenbach, and later Robert de Boron layered the tale with courtly love and Christian sanctity. The Grail moved from rumor to literature, and literature made it exemplary. Knights swore oaths, kings sought divine legitimacy, poets wrote parables about virtue. The narrative is neat. Every gap is filled by symbolism. That neatness is its power. You have seen that version in images. Think of stained glass windows, of an altar lit at dawn, of knights kneeling in empty chapels. Think of Hollywood. Monty Python made it absurd. Indiana Jones made it cinematic. The Da Vinci Code reimagined it as a secret lineage. Each retelling keeps the Grail inside a Christian frame, either as the cup of Christ or something intimately connected to Christian passion. These images have been recomposed for centuries, and repetition has made them feel inevitable. There are 3 cinematic frames that crystallize the official myth and make it persuasive. First, the relic frame. The Grail is a physical object, miraculous because of its direct link to Christ. Second, the quest frame. The pursuit of the Grail becomes the soul's journey, moral testing disguised as adventure. Third, the national frame. The Grail lands in Britain, allowing medieval rulers and later national storytellers to graft sacred legitimacy onto territorial claims. Together, these frames produce a story that is morally clean and politically useful. Listen to the voices the official story borrows. A textbook voice would say, "The Grail connects Christian salvation to heroic virtue." A sermon voice assures the faithful, through humility and penance, the Holy Cup returns to those chosen by God. A patriotic chronicle intones, "Our island holds Christ's vessel, proof of divine favor upon our people." Each voice is rounded, confident, and constructed to comfort. They make suffering tolerable. They transform conquest into pilgrimage. Why is this version so sticky? Because it answers anxieties. When kingdoms were insecure, a relic offered a sense of continuity with the sacred past. When rulers needed obedience, a quest narrative supplied moral tests that justified hierarchy. When ordinary people faced famine or disease, miracle tales told them suffering could be redeemed if faith and virtue were present. It's a tidy explanatory package, one that simplifies complexity into catechism, into pageantry, into national myth. Yet neat stories need institutions to propagate them. The church, medieval courts, scribes and later printers, and modern entertainment industries all play roles. Monasteries conserved manuscripts, bishops blessed narratives, troubadours sang them at courts. Later, print and film amplified them. Over time, the Grail became more than a story. It became a cultural product that reassures, legitimizes, and sells. Consider how the Grail functions as a metaphor. In sermons, it is the soul's cup. In courtly literature, it is honor and chastity. In national histories, it is divine endorsement for rule. Every adaptation softens inconvenient truth. Conflicts, mass violence, and the messy political deals behind Christian expansion evaporate into allegory. The result is comforting. Heroes, tests, redemption. The more people hear it, the more the story feels like memory rather than invention. We must be honest. The official version is not purely fiction nor purely documentation. It blends biblical fragments, medieval imagination, and political utility. Many elements are inventions: the miraculous powers, the crossing to Britain, the chivalric tests. Yet the story's ingredients, Last Supper imagery, reverence for relics, fascination with kingship, are grounded in real practices and beliefs. This mixture is what makes the version so convincing. It borrows authority from scripture and ritual while introducing new, useful meanings. Now listen to three short, synthetic quotes, voices that could easily have been recorded in a monastery, a court, or a classroom. First, a monastery chronicle. A cup which held the Lord's wine. How holier can a relic be? To possess it is to possess God's favor. Second, a courtly troubadour. A knight who finds the Grail is purified. He returns like dawn to heal the realm. Third, a civic historian. Our island's claim rests on sacred proof. The Grail sanctifies rule. Each is plausible, each is tidy, and each obscures the messy trade-offs behind the tale. Who benefits when the Grail is presented this way? The list is predictable. Churches gain moral authority and pilgrimage income. Rulers receive a sanctifying narrative that binds subjects to sovereignty. Poets and artists find rich symbolic soil. Merchants and later entertainment industries profit from the spectacle. In short, the Grail is an idea that distributes advantage widely among institutions eager for moral and financial returns. The version offers convenient erasures. It removes the pre-Christian rituals that might challenge ecclesiastical monopoly. It downplays the violence of colonization and conversion. It erases alternative spiritual traditions and folds their elements into Christian meanings. The Grail appears as an extension of Christian teleology rather than as a contested symbol that could be claimed by many communities for different reasons. On the scale of public persuasion, the Grail narrative is a masterpiece of simplification. It instructs without burdening its audience with nuance. Parents teach children the tidy story. Churches preach it. Novels and films recycle it. Each repetition reinforces the sense that the Grail was always Christian, always sacred, always pointing to spiritual purity. And yet, as we will see, this smooth surface hides seams. At this moment, the official story is emotionally powerful and institutionally reinforced. But it must also be recognized as an artifact of cultural selection. Certain versions were chosen, amplified, and canonized while others were neglected, suppressed, or forgotten. That selection process is not neutral. It reflects power dynamics: who had access to scriptoria, who controlled patronage, what political aims were being served. You might ask, if this version is so neat, how did it become the common sense of centuries? Part of the answer is simple repetition. Another part is the neat story begins to crack when we look at dates, sources, and what's simply missing. The first, most blunt contradiction is chronological. The Grail, as a named and storied object, does not appear in Christian literature until the late 12th century. For a relic supposedly connected directly to Christ, silence for 1,000 years is not a small gap. It is a glaring absence that demands explanation. Imagine an archivist in a dim repository, leafing through patristic writings and inventories of relics from the 4th to 10th centuries. What would she find? Bones, fragments of the true cross, pieces of martyrs' clothing. She would find exhaustive lists, but she would not find the cup of the Last Supper. That lack is factual. The New Testament never describes a preserved chalice. Early church fathers and catalogs of relics do not mention a cup preserved from the Passion. This silence is a fact. It is not an absence explainable by poor record-keeping alone. When the most precious relic imaginable is missing from the inventories of relic-hungry centuries, something odd is happening. The second fissure is textual inconsistency within the medieval sources themselves. When the Grail finally appears in literature, it arrives in fragmentary and contradictory forms. Chrétien de Troyes, writing at the end of the 12th century, introduces a mysterious Graal in a Romance context, but it is described as a serving dish, a plate, not a holy chalice. A different author, Wolfram von Eschenbach, transforms the Graal into a stone with cosmic powers. Robert de Boron later explicitly ties the object to Christ's blood. These are not small stylistic quibbles. They are wholesale disagreements about the object's nature. Scenes of medieval readers must have been confusing. Imagine a noble listening to a jongleur who tells of a glowing stone from heaven, then later encountering a monk who insists the Grail is a sacred vessel of the Passion. The multiplicity of forms suggests we are watching a folk motif being refitted to different ideological projects. It is probable, and historians largely agree, that the term was flexible and migratory, a motif moving across oral and written cultures, plucked into different narratives because it served different rhetorical needs. Third, consider provenance claims. The popular tale that Joseph of Arimathea carried the Grail to Britain reads like a comforting national fable. But on closer scrutiny, it looks increasingly like creative nationalistic retrofitting. The linkage between Joseph and Britain first appears well after the Gospels, in medieval romance, when linking sacred history to national history confers prestige. That is, plausible patronage in politics liked nothing better than sacred validation. The British island as a repository of relics is convenient for local elites. It produces a divine line of legitimacy that secular rulers could leverage. Now examine the political context of the tale's blossoming. The late 12th century was not a neutral moment. Europe was mobilizing for the Crusades. Kings, princes, and popes needed sanctified narratives to animate armies, justify expansion, and generate popular consent. The sudden rise of Grail literature around this period raises a question historians must ask. Was the motif intentionally amplified at a time when religious fervor needed narrative fuel? The correlation of timing does not prove causation, but it does suggest motive and opportunity. Let us look at manuscript production. Monastic scriptoria copied and circulated texts. They chose what to preserve. Records show that certain tales, especially those aligning with ecclesiastical or aristocratic interests, received preferential copying. Manuscripts that questioned church power or suggested alternative sacred lineages rarely survived, often because they were suppressed or neglected. This selection bias tells a story. The archive we inherit is not neutral. What people read in the Middle Ages was shaped by power. Now to sources. The earliest explicit Grail narratives come from courtly romance, not from liturgy or theological treatises. That is a crucial point. Romance literature operated in a world of allegory, patronage, and social performance. Writers like Crane wrote for noble audiences who wanted exemplars of chivalry and moral testing. Their inventions read like didactic fiction stories used to instruct social elites in acceptable virtues. To find the Grail first in this sphere suggests that the object served at least partly as a social technology. We should set out the contradictions with a clean structure: chronology, textual form, provenance claims, and political timing. Each of these independently weakens the simple official story. Together, they create a pattern. The Grail does not descend from apostolic memory. It emerges from medieval literary culture at a moment of political need. Consider this serving dish problem closely. Crane's description is concrete. We can picture a plate passed in a ceremonial context. But when later writers recast it as a cup or as a stone, they change the object's theological resonance. A cup tied to Christ's blood supports a passion relic narrative. A stone invokes cosmic and even pre-Christian metaphysical meanings. These varying translations of the Grail motif suggest that authors were not reporting a fixed tradition, but were creatively repurposing symbols. Now imagine an archivist uncovering marginalia scribes annotating manuscripts, crossing out passages, inserting glosses. Such traces sometimes reveal editorial interventions, lines removed for sensibilities, additions made to please patrons. In some cases, glosses reframe pagan images as Christian. This is crucial. Editorial activity is evidence of an active cultural translation, conscious attempts to reshape meaning for new audiences. If medieval intellectuals were recasting images, then the Grail's Christian wrapping may be the result of conscious reassignment of an older symbol. Next, the religious silence must be framed not as mere accident, but as strategic omission. Churchmen often cataloged relics to claim authority over them and to profit from pilgrimage. If a cup of Christ had existed in early centuries, one would expect references from bishops or pilgrims eager to claim prestige. That absence is therefore suggestive. It does not incontrovertibly prove fabrication, but it does shift the burden of explanation. Why were there no earlier claims? The lack is a piece of evidence that points us toward alternative origins. A competing line of evidence comes from Celtic and continental folk motifs. Across Wales, Ireland, and Brittany, there are stories of magical cauldrons, vessels of rejuvenation, abundance, and resurrection. The cauldron of Ceridwen, the Dagda's cauldron, the cauldron of, and these are recurring images. Archaeology confirms the importance of cauldrons in ritual contexts. Large bronze vessels appear in some burials, sometimes with offerings. These vessels were symbols of communal feasting and likely had sacred connotations. When Christianity moved into these regions, it encountered powerful local symbols embedded in community life. Conversion strategies varied. Sometimes pagan symbols were destroyed, other times they were reinterpreted into Christian frames. The Grail, if it descended from these cauldron traditions, would be a prime candidate for appropriation. A cauldron of plenty can be reframed as a cup of divine abundance. The thematic parallel is strong. Both promise renewal. But similarity is not identity. Showing influence does not equate to direct lineage. That is an interpretive move historians must make carefully, signaling probability rather than proof. Another striking inconsistency lies in the lack of early liturgical function. If the Grail were a relic of the Passion, it would likely have a place in liturgy prayers, feast days, relic translations. Yet until the 12th century, the liturgical record does not anchor such a relic. The Grail's sudden literary embodiment without liturgical entrenchment suggests it was a narrative invention rather than a practice-centered relic. It is as if poetry invented an object and theology later retrofit meaning onto it. Who then had motive to create or amplify such an object in literature? The answer is multiple. Monastic orders seeking influence, aristocrats seeking sacral legitimization, political actors wanting moral language for campaigns. The Crusades offer a vivid example. Crusade preaching sought to frame violence as sanctified penance. Miraculous objects and promises of eternal reward were scientific analysis, where it exists, rarely corroborates Holy Grail level antiquity. Metalwork of cups claimed to be the Grail often dates to medieval centuries, not to 1st century Judea. That is not a final disproof. The reuse of objects over centuries complicates dating, but it does show that physical attributions are late and culturally situated. Finally, a rhetorical point. When narratives serve power, they are rarely neutral. The Grail in its official form consolidated structures of authority. It naturalized a certain relationship between the sacred and the monarchic. It made violence legible as spiritual duty. That makes the Grail not merely an object of devotion, but also an instrument of governance. So what do these first fishers leave us with? They leave questions. Who named this object the Grail? When did it stop being a local ritual motif and become a Christian relic? Which actors, monks, poets, princes had the most to gain from that change? Each question opens a door into the cultural workshop where old symbols were retouched and then sold as sanctity. This is not academic hair-splitting. These are cracks large enough to let daylight into a story many have been told to accept without question. The tidy picture of a continuous chain from Christ to Arthur to our screens is, at best, a simplification, and at worst an act of historical smoothing that hides contest, negotiation, and erasure. There is more to uncover. The fictions of poems and the politics of crusading converge in predictable ways, and in the next section we will step behind the curtain into scriptoria, into patron dinners, into bishops' chambers to see how the Grail was reshaped and who held the scissors. The scratches on the manuscript margins are small, but together they trace the hand of deliberate cultural work, and that work points toward powerful motives and consequences. Behind the Christian facade there is a quieter, older geography of meaning, a landscape of feasts, fires, and bronze. Long before a chalice was imagined as sacred in a Christian way, certain communities in Britain, Ireland, and Brittany treated large metal vessels as centers of ritual life. These were not mere kitchen pots. They were focal objects in seasonal rites, in the telling of ancestry, in the exchange of food and power. Archaeologists digging in riverine peat or hollow barrows find fragments of bronze cauldrons and sets of offerings placed deliberately beside them. Imagine a misty hill at dawn, a circle of people, steam rising from a cauldron, a chant low and repetitive. That scene is the Grail's shadow life. The myths preserve the memory. In Wales a tale sings of Ceridwen, her cauldron of transformation and bitter storms of change. The people who once gathered around a cauldron for seasonal rites now kneel in the nave. What has been gained and what has been erased is often invisible to future generations. These are the backstage choices that made the Grail fit neatly into Christian ideologies. But the machinery that built that fit did not operate in a vacuum. It accelerated when war, conquest, and crusade raised the demand for symbols that could do more than comfort. The next scene will show exactly how, in the heat of battle and the shadow of victory, the Church transformed opportunism into a deliberate cultural program, and how one suspicious discovery lit the fuse. The turning point comes with blood on the ground. The First Crusade is not an abstract epic, but a sequence of summers lived by men who marched, slaughtered, and slept in tents, and by clerics who recorded triumphs as miracles. It is 1098. The Crusaders, ragged and starving, have taken Antioch after months of siege. Morale is fragile. Desertion and hunger dog the camps. In that context, acclaimed Relic can function like fresh water. It gives meaning to suffering. It promises cosmic approval. A monk named Peter Bartholomew will claim he found a lance, an object said to have pierced Christ at the crucifixion. His visions and the ensuing discovery package deliver a narrative pivot. Gods are on the Crusaders' side. Historians note that such findings often surface precisely when enthusiasm flags. The timing matters. Whether the lance was authentic is less the point than how the claim was used. In a muddy siege camp, a spear becomes an engine of morale. The faithful gather, relic in hand, and feel connected to cosmic favor. Troops rally. This pattern is not unique to Antioch. Across medieval Europe, objects with miraculous provenance are produced and publicized at strategic moments. The point is less archaeology than psychology. A tangible object makes intangible promises feel believable. It transforms despair into purpose. That very effect is what elite actors discovered and cultivated. Back in the monasteries, the reaction is swift and strategic. Leaders observe, a relic can do more than bless an army. It can attract donations, legitimize territorial claims, and draw pilgrims that fill coffers. A lost object of Christendom is the perfect product, sacred, scarce, and marketable. What follows is a pattern of reification, an abstract set of ideas turned into a concrete quest. At this note of history, Cistercian networks become crucial. Founded in 1098 and growing rapidly in the following decades, Cistercian monasteries formed a transnational lattice of houses tied to reformist impulses in the Church. They are not monolithic conspirators, but they are professionalized centers of manuscript production and spiritual discipline. Many Cistercians placed value on austere piety and rigorous administration. They were also connected to ecclesiastical hierarchies that reached into Rome. Their scriptoria and patrons make them effective cultural engines. Coordinated copying of tales, patronage of particular poets, and the steering of liturgical emphasis are not conspiracies so much as bureaucratic culture-making. A monastery that produces a romance connecting a sacred object to the passion aligns itself with the broader mission of the Church. When these texts circulate among courts read aloud in great halls, they carry the new symbolic economy into the imagination of rulers and their retinues. The Grail narrative becomes a performative script. If a king or knight is associated with it, he is invested with a sanctity that rationalizes rule and warfare. That is beside the immediate human horror of crusading. The capture of Antioch and the march on Jerusalem are accompanied by massacres of Muslim and Jewish civilians, as well as internecine Christian violence. When a relic is used to justify these actions, the moral calculus is simple and devastating. Possession of the sacred proves righteousness. Righteousness sanctifies conquest. The logic corrodes ethical restraints. A man fighting under the banner of a relic is reassured. Killing is an instrument of divine will. Institutions that profit from expansion watch this logic and learn. The ripple effects back home are rapid. Chronicles are written and rewritten. The victorious narrative is tidy. Heroes, miracles, divine sanction. Hard facts: who ordered civilian massacres, who negotiated truces, who profited from sieges, are smoothed into providential arcs. A version that comforts donors and legitimizes ecclesiastical expansion is the version that gets copied and patronized. Texts that complicate the story seldom survive. This is archival selection at work. At the same time, the Church needs a longer-term symbol, not merely a lance that rallies at a single siege. A perpetual quest object is strategically superior. It motivates knights to seek penance through adventure. It institutionalizes hierarchy. Only the purest will succeed, and it creates markets for relics and tours alike. The Grail is a sought-after object, always near, always almost within reach, fits the social technology the Church desired. It is neither purely theological nor purely literary. It is a cultural instrument. Key literary figures play interpretive roles. Chrétien de Troyes, at the end of the 12th century, introduces a Graal in a courtly romance, ambiguous and oddly described as a serving dish. Later, Wolfram von Eschenbach turns that motif into a stone, and Robert de Boron explicitly ties the object to the Passion. These shifts are not mere aesthetic whims. They reflect different audiences, patrons, and agendas. For an audience steeped in courtly values, the Grail is a test of personal virtue. For a writer entangled with theological currents, the Grail is passion, relic, and theological anchor. The movement between versions maps a tug of war over meaning. Consider a monastery conservatory where a poet is asked to compose a tale honoring a patron. The poet is given theological cues. He writes an object that will appeal to both knightly audiences and clerical interpreters. That is the kind of cultural brokerage that constructs myth from motifs. It is worth imagining the conversations. The abbot reminding the poet of orthodoxy, the patron asking for lineage, the jongleur crafting spectacle. The end product looks inevitable only in retrospect. The consequences for local, non-Christian ritual practices are immediate and material. A community that once gathered around a cauldron may find its rituals denounced as superstition, its sacred sites appropriated, its elders labeled as pagans. New forms of devotion are promoted with institutional force, sermons, feast days, and relic-centered pilgrimages. As pilgrims travel, markets sprout, donations flow to churches and monasteries, and economic incentives align with ecclesiastical narratives. Culture and capital now support the new symbolic order. This is not to say resistance did not exist. There were popular rebellions, clandestine rituals preserved in private houses, saints' cults that syncretized old beliefs under new names. But resistance had little access to the channels of preservation that mattered. The winners wrote the books, funded the copies, and claimed the shrines. Over generations, popular memory is sedimented into official memory. The Grail, as it becomes Christianized, is an index of that sedimentation. Yet, even amid coercion, the Grail retained the adaptive resonance of older symbols. Its themes abundance, rebirth, mystery had a lasting spiritual value. That elasticity is why the object could be repurposed for clerical ends. The thing people longed for could be rebranded to point somewhere else. The medieval church was not inventing desire, it was redirecting it. By the end of this period, the Grail narrative has been weaponized and monetized. It moralizes violence and sanctifies hierarchy, while simultaneously satisfying a deep human hunger for renewal and meaning. Those who wrote the tale were not always cynics. Some were sincere reformers, others ambitious clerics, others poets seeking patronage. The moral clarity of the story's outcome, only the pure find. The Grail masks a complicated human calculus. Promotion, survival, piety, and profit entangled in a story that would eventually travel from cloister to castle to cathedral window. The question that remains, and that we will examine next, is how this the content itself, chosen and funded by the powerful, set the terms of what people imagined as sacred. Distribution mattered. The Dagda's cauldron feeds armies without emptying. Ceridwen's brew grants wisdom. These vessels are described in stories that predate Christian scribes, and that, crucially, belong to communal rites, feasts, funerals, rites of passage. They were sensory objects a-clang when the lid lifted, sweet steam and bitter herbs rising, the crowd's voices around a glowing fire. Archaeological contexts, burial deposits, votive offerings in lakes and bogs suggest these cauldrons had social as well as symbolic weight. When missionaries and early medieval clerics encountered these practices, they faced a practical problem. Pagan rites were rooted in community life. Banning them often meant alienating whole populations. The Church's response, over centuries, mixed condemnation with accommodation. Many Christian missionaries rewrote pagan festivals as saints' days. They baptized sacred places rather than destroy them. The material cauldron, then, did not vanish overnight. It was reframed. Some early texts and marginal glosses show hybrid language. Vessels that give in miraculous ways are recast as miracles of Christian saints rather than as the work of local gods. This transitional phase, roughly between the 5th and 11th centuries, is often invisible in high-visibility chronicles, but it is detectable in liturgical patterns, in the continued presence of communal feasting attached to church calendars, and in the survivals of folklore recorded later. Imagine a village on a damp evening. A wooden hall, the smell of barley and salted meat, an old woman telling a tale about an unending pot of stew, while a priest quietly prepares the altar for a festival service that will include the same communal meal. The forms overlap, meanings shift. The decisive rebranding, the moment when the cauldron becomes a Christian cup with salvific properties, occurs most visibly during the high medieval surge of crusading zeal, cathedral building, and monastic reform. Its endurance is precisely the result of its malleability. The reason a pagan cauldron could become a Christian cup is the same reason the image still appears in blockbuster films and tourist brochures. The honest history is therefore a story about cultural translation and institutional advantage, about the way symbols get fit to the institutions that need them. That translation left scars, erased rites, silenced elders, displaced gods. But it also produced a living myth that continues to tell us about medieval selves, the ambitions, the fears, and the bargains that forged a new religious imagination. The next question is obvious and dangerous. If the Grail's meaning was rewritten so effectively, what has this remaking done to our understanding of heroism, holiness, and historical truth? A tourist stand in a European cathedral sells hand-painted cups and glossy paperback novels. A classroom projects a cinematic clip of knights crossing misty moors. A fascicle of documents in a digital archive reveals scribal corrections that made a pagan reference read more Christian. Social media stitches these fragments into new narratives. An influencer posing with a chalice-branded mug, a film clip remixed with a modern pop song. The Grail's image migrates through touch, sight, and sound. Each migration changes its force. The medieval machinery of meaning-making survives, but now it runs on cameras, algorithms, and markets as much as on parchment and stained glass. The crucial question is whether we notice the seams, the places where old edits meet modern edits, and whether we choose to pull them apart. As the pattern shows, the Grail's afterlife is not a single story but a marketplace of versions. Each version does something. It comforts, it legitimizes, it sells. Recognizing that does not debunk the emotional power of the myth. It simply reveals the stakes of who benefits when a symbol is stabilized. The next step is intimate and uncomfortable, putting a more honest portrait of the medieval makers beside the modern uses and asking what we are willing to keep and what we must interrogate. Because symbols shape judgment as surely as laws do, and the Grail's journey from cauldron to chalice is as much a lesson in cultural power as it is a story about faith. We began with a monk by candlelight inventing certainty. We ended in a world where that invention still shapes how millions imagine sanctity, heroism, and nation. The excavation of objects, texts, and motives shows that the Grail is not a recovered relic but a manufactured memory, a palimpsest of pagan vessels, medieval scriptoria, monastic politics, and modern markets. The deeper question is not whether the Grail really existed in biblical times. The deeper question is how institutions fashion the past to serve present power, and how comfortable we are with believing what comfort provides. If a single symbol could be rewritten so completely, what other accepted histories were deliberately stitched to present a useful truth? If you watched this to the end, thank you, and if this video unsettled a memory you took for granted, share where you grew up, city/country, and how you were taught the story. Subscribe to follow the dossier. There are more myths waiting to be opened, and each one changes the way we see the present.